Today's presentation on charter schools will include two panelists. Mark Tallman is Associate Executive Director of the Kansas Association of School Boards, where he supervises advocacy, communications, and research. He has had governmental relations, policy, and communication responsibilities for KASB since 1990. Mark's primary areas of expertise include Kansas school funding, academic achievement, and education governance. Mark has a master's degree in public administration from the University of Kansas with a thesis on the enactment of the 1992 Kansas School Finance Law. Delia Softshire. Dr. Delia Softshire is an educator and vocational advocate for education reform. She has served as president of the Holy Savior Catholic Academy. Prior to that, she was the principal for Holy Savior for over 20 years. She also teaches multicultural education classes at Southwestern University. Dr. Shropshire received her PhD in educational leadership from Capella University. And now we're ready to start with Mark Tallman.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us, and thanks to the host for putting on this program. It's a pleasure to be here, try to share some information with you. Since I'm going first, I thought I would start by giving just a little bit of background about the issue of vouchers and school choice before kind of going into the position, I guess, of my organization and others, but I'm sure Dr. Shropshire can add anything I may miss in some of that background information. One thing I guess from a historical viewpoint is probably most of you know is that public education very much started in this country as a local function, and that's long how it has been treated, and for many, many decades was almost entirely funded at the local level, often largely by property taxes, and that's how the system grew up. Students were always part of a school district in Kansas and most other states. They were entitled to go to that school district, they're entitled to go to schools usually decided by those school boards, and that's where most of the funding resided. But over time, there's been a shift in emphasis in many school states, including Kansas, where the states play a larger role in funding, and also over time an increase in some level of federal funding becoming involved. And so there has been, for about the 30 years at least that I've worked for KASB, as you've heard, a growing interest and debate over whether the state or federal government should play a larger role in supporting funding for non-public school options for students. These take several forms, and kind of the original idea, at least as I understand and remember it, was called a voucher system, which is basically where state dollars would be set aside specifically to cover the costs of students attending private schools. First such program that I'm aware of was in the state of Wisconsin, actually focused in the Milwaukee area. Now, there have been several other different approaches to how these programs are structured. They're often still called vouchers. In other words, vouchers is kind of a generic term for any program which provides public aid for students attending private schools. But all programs are not the same. Another popular model in some cases is what's called tax credit scholarships. And we have a program like that in Kansas. It was instituted 5 or 6 years ago, I believe. It has been expanded. The idea behind this program is instead of having state tax dollars directly appropriated, the state gives tax credits to individuals or other taxpayers who make contributions to independent organizations, and those organizations have to use those dollars to provide scholarships for students attending private schools. As I said, this program has been in Kansas for several years now, and it was rather dramatically expanded in the last legislative session. A final approach to this, and there may be others, but one that's kind of getting a lot of attention now and in our state, pardon me, I'm kind of looking at my notes over here on the screen, is, called education savings account. And the idea behind education savings accounts kind of goes more back to that voucher approach. It is the concept of taking state dollars that might otherwise go to the public school where a student would attend, set it aside in this case in an account which could be used for private school tuition, but at least in the proposal of Kansas, could also be used for other authorized expenses by the state, to purchase educational services, to buy curriculum or testing material or other efforts like this. A proposal to do that in Kansas was presented and seriously debated and passed the Kansas House this legislative session. So it would have in effect created a second program within the state to provide assistance to students who wanted to attend private schools. That, as I said, passed the House. It ultimately did not pass the full legislature. We would expect that there will be continued debate and discussion over that concept coming up. So let me talk a few minutes about how my organization and many other public school focused organizations, I want to say from the outset, not trying to say that we represent every individual school board member or school district or organization, but in general, most people involved in public education are concerned about these school choices that might be called programs for a couple of reasons. I think the main one is the idea that public education has always been designed to have to serve all students, not necessarily in a particular district or any particular school, but every school has the right to attend a school in their district. They have the right to be there unless they violate certain behavioral standards. Even there's a duration on that. And the public school must provide an array of services to meet the needs of that child. So no matter how difficult or expensive or whatever special needs they have, it's the obligation of the public school to try to provide those services. Generally speaking, voucher programs, and at least the ones that we have seen in Kansas now and have been proposed, do not put that same requirement on the participating private school. There are different standards for what students may be eligible or what schools may be eligible. But to this point, they've continued to allow private schools to set different expectations for admissions, behavioral standards. In other words, they're not required to take every child or every child based on common needs, but to be to some extent exclusive. I'm not trying to say that that's necessarily a bad thing from the viewpoint of schools who want to choose an audience they want to serve or maybe feel they best can serve. But the concern from, I think, public school advocates is inevitably it tends to mean that the public system, which has to serve all kids, will increasingly have the responsibility for students who are not able or chosen or whatever the case may be to attend a private school. And so the concern behind that is it runs the risk of kind of creating a two-tier educational system. This then leads in some other questions because to some extent there is an issue of you reinforce a reputation. If a school has to serve a given population and those students who, again, may seem a better fit for a private school are allowed and by the state given funding to leave, that school must be left to serve the more expensive, the more challenging students. By many measures, that school may not look as good on paper. One of the things we know now is that schools are often evaluated simply by looking at test scores, because that's a common result we have. What test scores don't take into account in many other measures is what is the demographics of the population you have to serve. We know that in both public and private schools, there are big differences in achievement, whether test scores or other measures that are based on factors like income level. Lower income students, students coming out of poverty tend not to do as well because they bring special additional needs to the school. Same is true with special education services, for example. And so too often when we look, in fact, I had a conversation with a relative this weekend who was talking about, and this was not in Kansas, in another state, basically saying, well, I know some folks, our neighbors, they're looking at leaving, they're wanting to do a different place with better schools. My question was, well, does that mean, better in what way? Better schools in the sense that this is an area that does not have as much poverty, does not have as many special challenges, in which case that may be seen as a more desirable school. but it's not the fault of either the school or the students that they're having to make these services. Same is true in many other areas. So that's a top level concern. I think a few other things that we often hear is raised as part of the discussion. One is the question of who are the students that would be eligible for these programs? And of course, this really depends on what the program is structured to be. If these are set up by the state government, as in Kansas, then the state gets to decide those. Our current tax credit scholarship system was originally only eligible for students who were eligible or qualified for free meals. So in other words, students with pretty low income levels in their families. They also had to be attending a school that had one of the 100 lowest elementary schools in terms of, again, looking at test scores. Well, predictably, these were almost all high poverty schools. Last year during the legislature, that qualification was changed to include reduced price eligible students who are not as low income, moves higher on the income level, still would be considered low income across the spectrum of all students, and to essentially any public elementary or middle school, but not high schools. That also significantly increased the number of students which would be eligible, but didn't necessarily focus that eligibility on the students with the highest need. The education savings account bill that was considered would have been open to students who are identified as being at risk in their public school, which means they would be, for example, having lower test score issues or other factors that might be decided, but there would not be an income threshold. So a student who might be having, again, scoring low on test scores on some level, having some attendance problems, but maybe had really no financial need, in that case would still be eligible. Another area of discussion, again, which we may want to talk about, is what determines whether or not this private school would be eligible for a student attending to get these benefits. Part of the debate comes back to this. The state of Kansas has an accreditation system for all public schools. Many private schools, particularly the Catholic and Lutheran schools in the state and a few others, choose to go through the state accreditation process, in which case they have to participate in state assessments. There's data out there that can kind of be compared. However, there are some private schools that do not go through the state process, and so they may be accredited by a regional agency or another agency, but don't provide that data to the state, and another set of private schools that aren't accredited at all. So that's another choice that has to be looked at. That also kind of determines if parents are looking to choose schools, what comparable information there might be available. So these are some of the factors when as an association, we've looked at these issues that really have raised concerns on our part. The concern fundamentally is this is something that certainly some parents may want to choose. Some students may do well or better in a different school. But the question is the choice really with the parent or with the school? Our concern has always been if there are standards of either admission or retention, or even if the private school simply isn't able to meet their needs, even if they want to, it really removes that as a choice or option. The child then still may turn to the public school, but in a sense, that public school has perhaps lost students and therefore lost funding. In Kansas, as most of you probably know, our school finance system starts with how many students do you enroll? That's the basis, and based on that number, the district then receives a base amount from the state. They may receive additional weightings from the state. They're allowed to adopt a local option budget on top of that. That's based on an enrollment or a budget that is based on enrollment. And so one of the concerns is that if these programs encourage or allow some students to make that transfer to a private school, ultimately the public school will lose the dollars for those students. That's just the way our system was set up. That too creates a concern that may be, it erodes the budget and leaves potentially less funding, less support for the students who are still left in that program. So that remains a concern. I want to just see if there's any other points I wanted to make. Certainly look forward, if you will, if there are questions that that come out. Oh, one other thing I think may be an interesting point to have some discussion over is we've tried to look very closely at the issue of, can we make performance comparisons between public and private schools? About the only consistent data that we have that can be looked at would be looking at test scores. There are a lot of limitations to that, both public and private, but it is data available. If you simply look at the average state accredited private school system in Kansas, they will look to be doing better than the average of all state school systems across the state. But that becomes much less pronounced. In fact, there's relatively little difference if you compare private schools or private school systems to public schools or public school systems that have a similar student demographic. In other words, if you look at comparable numbers of low-income kids qualifying for free or reduced lunch meals, qualifying for special education services, in that case, the numbers are much closer. Because one of the things we know is whether public or private, the results tend to be better in lower income schools. So it's really critical to keep in mind that if one of the arguments is, well, private schools get better results, it's important to understand private schools have results that are similar to public schools that have similar populations. Now, there are, of course, other things to look at other than just test scores, but on an academic front, that's one way or one place that we have fairly comparable data. So I think those are really some of the key points I want to make. There's certainly some additional things that we could talk about, but I want to make sure that Dr. Shropshire has a chance to provide any background to her point. And then if there are some issues that come up through questions or however we want to respond, I will let the presenters kind of manage how we do that. So thank you very much for your attention.
And Dr. Delia Shropshire.
Good afternoon, everyone. Again, I would like to thank all of the hosts for the opportunity to share and further enlighten and give information about school choice. More importantly, the tax credit program, that's the one that is most affected our institution and the Diocese of Wichita. I have been to Topeka several years to testify on behalf of school choice, along with other schools, just to give students an opportunity to change their lives in an environment that matches their abilities. So first, I want to say, first and foremost, it is not about public versus private. It is about public and private schools working together to help students to find a fit for their academic, social, emotional, and spiritual needs. Holy Savior Catholic Academy has been doing that for quite some time, even before school choice was legislated where we could receive some funding. We funded those students on our own. We went out and raised development monies and had fundraisers to support students who would like to attend Holy Savior Catholic Academy. I also can speak to the fact that Holy Savior Catholic Academy and many of the inner core Catholic schools aren't creaming. We're not being selective about students. If you so choose to come to Holy Savior, we do our best to accommodate. Even before school choice, there are many students who receive public education services. They're on an IEP and need some extra support. We work very closely with our public school liaison, and we match those services and their schedules. Those students have to be dually enrolled so that the public school will not lose funding for their attendance. Those students, even after we have tax credit scholarships available, those students continue to dual enroll so that the public school can receive funding and so that we can work together to provide services to those students. We have buses that come in and off our campus all day long for students between kindergarten and 8th grade to go to public school to receive services. And I am very delighted that we have that partnership. So the scholarship granting organizations that provide tax credit scholarships, there are 10 in Kansas. I don't know if Anybody knows all of those, so I'll quickly run through the list of those organizations. Catholic Education Foundation, Renew a Nation, Community First, Topeka Lutheran School Foundation, Christian Faith Center Incorporated, Support for Catholic Schools, the Independent School, A Scholarship SGO, Kansas LLC, Catholic Diocese of Salina Education Fund, and Prime Fit Youth Foundation. Out of that list, we participate in 3 of those scholarship granting organizations for students to send Holy Savior. So as Mr. Tallman mentioned, about 5 or 6 years, this has been in process and the law has been enacted. Initially, you had to qualify for free lunch for tax to be eligible for tax credit scholarship, and you had to live in one of the 100 what they call lowest performing public school areas. This allows students who lived in those areas to attend a school of their choice. Many of those students were often always eligible to attend the inner core Catholic schools because their base school was in close proximity to the Catholic school if their parents so choose to send them to a Catholic school. This now made it affordable. It also helped the schools that we didn't have to have as intense fundraising to support the students that we were already accepting into our building prior to tax credit scholarships being available. In July 2021, the expansion of the bill allowed for free and reduced families, qualified families to be eligible, and that school performance list went away and it was available to students K through 8. The wonderful thing about tax credit scholarships is that if you attend Holy Savior, we have always prepared students to go on to the Catholic high schools, and we raise money to help them continue to go on to Catholic high school if they so choose. Well, the tax credit scholarship will then follow them. So if they want to matriculate to one of the Catholic high schools or either another private high school, then the money will follow them. We know from an adverse child experience study, it's called ACEs. It's an acronym, capital A, capital C, capital E, capital S. Adverse childhood experience study. I stand corrected, the S may be lowercase. It identifies that children who live in poverty, live in stress, they experience childhood trauma. When they experience that childhood trauma, the brain starts to operate differently as a result of the trauma. And that child cannot learn. It's not that they don't want to learn, they don't have the parental support, they're not getting sleep at night, all of those factors that we look at, it is really a brain function. Out of that study, they found that one positive adult relationship can begin to alter the chemical in the brain to allow that part of the brain that was affected by trauma to heal. And then that student then can process the knowledge that teachers are trying to impart. And so with that being said, it's not about school choice to disparage any school system. It's about finding the place that fits a student where they can begin the process of healing so they can learn. And speaking of money and funding, on the front end, I do not know the numbers exactly for the number of students who qualify for tax credit scholarships, but I remember testifying at the state that someone brought up that information. And the number of kids that qualify and are actually participating in the program will not greatly impact public school funding because it's not as large of a pool as you think it may be. Additionally, the point is, what happens to these students when they grow up if they are allowed to stay in the school where they're not flourishing? Think about the money spent when they are not able to get a job, or they're not able to participate in the tax pool because they don't have a job, they don't have an education, they may get in trouble. Think about the cost of incarceration. Think about the monies that taxpayers will pay and spend if they're not successful. School choice allows parents, educators, politicians, everyone to work together for the best solution for kids. It's not about disparaging public school, and it's certainly not about accusing private schools of being selective. We have kids on IEPs, and if you take Holy Savior's demographic, you can compare it to a school that is right here in our community that is a public school. You take the names off and you probably, looking at the data, can't tell the difference. Kids are kids. Children need help. We know what the reading and the academic gap is all about. We know that children in poverty aren't reading at the level that they should be nationwide. 3rd and 4th graders are below grade level, and it's even more intense for African-American males. There has to be conversation about what we can do as educators, as school leaders, as politicians, to come together to help students be successful. I'm sorry, my mic is, that was my walkie. This last year, our number of tax credit scholarship students at Holy Savior increased by 50%, while many other schools enrollment declined due to COVID. Our enrollment went up because we were open and we were helping kids and helping families. The last thing I want to end with, and I'm open for questions, is this. We have to ensure that every child has a chance to learn, grow, and develop in an academic environment that meets their academic, cultural, social, emotional, and spiritual needs. We have all types of options of education for adults. You graduate from high school and you can go to a big college. You can go to a small local college. You can go online. There are many things that you can do so that that education will fit you. How important is it for us to help children who are in their earliest development stages, to help them to be in an environment that fits, whether it's a large classroom environment or a small classroom environment, whether it's a public environment or a private environment. Thank you for the opportunity, and I'm open for questions.
Okay, so if anyone has any questions, they can submit it on chat. I am going to ask a couple questions. It was mentioned, how does dual enrollment? How does dual enrollment work, and what is the effect on funding? Is the funding split between the public schools and the whether it's and the private entities, or how is that?
We do not receive funding for any of the students unless they are actually eligible for a tax credit scholarship. And that funding comes from the scholarship granting organization. The dual enrollment helps the public school to count the student so that they do not lose funding, because they are continuing to provide services while they are still a student at the Catholic school.
Is that specific to the Catholic schools, or do other, like I know there's, the independent school and collegiate, do they work the same way or do they work differently? Like, could it be where the student is in a private institution and they aren't enrolled in the public schools, and yet the funding goes to the private institution?
So, and I want to make sure I understand what Dr. Shropshire is talking about. I think what she's referring to is a student in special education. If you're a special education student with an IEP at a private school, then you're entitled to special ed services from the public school. And if the public school provides those, then the public school does get to count that student that they're giving special ed services to as part of their regular enrollment. I don't believe that that is true for non-special ed students. So I certainly be corrected if that's true.
No,
and then the other thing, go ahead.
You're exactly right. You're exactly right. I am speaking to students who qualify for services at the public school. So if they qualify for services at public school, in order for public school to have funding to service those students, the students are dually enrolled, which that speaks to the conversation about private schools not accepting students who need services. We do have partnerships where we do accept students who need services, and then we work closely with the public school, not only in the dual enrollment, but in their scheduling and all of the conferences in the IMP management and in the whole process.
Yeah, so a couple of comments. One, to go back to another one, I think the questioner listed some other schools. I'm not familiar with all the schools in the Wichita area, but for the most part, it are Catholic schools, Lutheran schools, and just one or two other schools around the state that are state accredited and participating. So there are some private schools. I certainly know here in Topeka, for example, we have Care Paravel, we have Topeka Collegiate, that are relatively well-known private schools, but they don't participate in this program because they're not state accredited. That's a choice they make. So one point I make. Second point, and I want to, Dr. Shropshire, I think you make a great point, and I always try to be very careful when we're kind of talking about not wanting to disparage one way or the other. I'm certainly not trying to disparage private schools. I went through private Catholic education myself, but I think the distinction is, I always try to say, it's not a concern, I think, about a deliberate effort to exclude. It's just a situation of how far can you go to meet all those needs. So when I've studied the demographics of private schools that are accredited, we find that, yes, across the state, probably about 5% of students in participating private schools are special ed students. So clearly, private schools do accept some special ed kids. They work in partnership. That's very good. Typically, a public school, though, is going to have 15% of its students who are receiving special services. My guess is that means that at least some private schools, can't speak to yours, obviously. It's not that would not necessarily say, we don't want to help this student with a special need, but we just can't do it. Even with the help of the public school system, we're just not prepared or able to provide everything that student wants. I think that's why there's that disparity. So certainly I don't think, and from everything I know of the Catholic education system, it's not an intentional effort to be discriminatory or exclusionary. The concern is just, though, the nature of what can be offered, we are concerned will still cause that disparity. And even if the intention of you and other leaders is not to disparage the system, where I agree, I think everyone wants to work together. Our concern is there may be others who will basically say, look, public schools are failing, you're not getting good education. That's why we need to do this. And our concern is that undermines that support that we hope has to be there for the system that, educates 90% of the kids in the state. So I don't want my remarks to be taken as disparaging of the Catholic school system or private schools in general, but we just have the concern based on simply the nature of how the different schools have to operate.
I agree. And I don't think my counter argument was that you were being disparaging, but that's the tone of the conversation. And it's also the conversation I heard in Topeka. So I feel like that I'm a voice to clear that up, because there was a lot of conversation in Topeka that said Catholic schools and private schools are creaming. They're excluding kids with health needs. They're excluding kids with educational needs. And I just want to say that there are counter arguments to that. Also, though, within any system, there is not one school that can service every student need. So, for example, we have students who need different type of services in the public school system. They're both in the kindergarten. One has to go to one school in the public school system, and one has to go to another school in the public school system. Why? Because that one public school does not have the consolidated services for education, special education that the other public school has. So that even happens within the public school system. No one school may be able to provide anyone's total and complete need, but all the schools in partnership can supply everyone's needs. And so if we make partnerships between schools where the students can be serviced and all needs be met, then that's a better, more hands make light work. And so that would make a better opportunity. So I'll say that example again. I have 2 students in public schools, both are kindergartners. One has to go to one public school in the system because of their needs. The other student has to go to another public school because they can't go to the same one together because that other public school cannot meet that student's needs. So again, that happens between public schools and public schools as well.
Okay. I do have this question. I grew up in Ohio, and that's actually where I am right now. So what I'm hearing, what some of my concerns are when they go into these tax credit scholarships and charter schools and things like that. What's happened here is that like for the Catholic schools, they need to have busing, and what that happens is it ends up getting taken out of the public schools monies, and they have to provide for that busing even though they don't get funded for that through the state, because the funding ends up going to the Catholic schools or the other private schools. We don't have the private schools like Wichita does, or they, not that I'm aware of here. And so to me, it's become more blurred. And is that the way it is in Kansas, or is that this is at the other end of the spectrum of how some of the funding issues are handled in Ohio versus Kansas? What is the leeway for that on Kansas? Where does Kansas stand on some of those issues?
Do you want to go ahead?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mark. We do not use public transportation, so I'm not sure what that issue is. I know there are some partnerships in rural schools between the public school system and the Catholic school to provide transportation, which I think is wonderful, because those parents still pay taxes. A lot of times we forget that even though a student is in private school, the parents still pay taxes to help fund other kids in public school. So those parents pay taxes. Now for us, we do not have public busing. Our parents have to bring their children to school. They carpool. There are other opportunities to get here, but we do not partner with the public school for transportation, except for those students who are on IEPs. Because they are on IEPs and they're dually enrolled, the public school provides transportation for them only to and from the Catholic school to the public school, not from their home to the school, to and from the public school to the private school and back. In the morning, the parents still have the responsibility of getting their kids to school. I hope that answered your question. Mr. Tallman?
My recollection of state law is that public schools are required to provide transportation to private school kids if they are on the same route and ride the same bus. And so it may be in Wichita, there just aren't, the bus routes being a more, cohesive urban area, but there's not a requirement of the public school to take kids to private schools to take the private school wherever they want to go, wherever they want to live. It's simply that if they can ride on the same route. Now that's my recollection of how that law still is. you make a good point to always remember in these discussions, because many of us know people or read things in the media about other states. Every state has its own school funding law for public schools. States that are starting to create these school choice plans or voucher plans, they write a law specific to that state. And so you may read something and it doesn't necessarily apply to Kansas in the same way, unless our law is written to do that.
Okay, and then I have one other question. So far, I haven't seen any questions pop up. What do you do? There's, I think it's kind of been mentioned here. There's no utopia in education. There's no one perfect place that's going to fit for everyone, and with special needs, not even just like special needs in terms of education, but the other other needs too for the child. They may need a private setting because of other reasons besides, IEPs and things like that. But because of the needs per person, one size doesn't necessarily fit all, either private or public. But what happens to the kids that truly don't have money to spend on any kind of education? With a public education, there are, free meal things to get them through where they can get an education without having to spend any money. Is that truly true with private education? I think you have to have some money in order to choose any type of private education, whether it be truly private or Catholic or, whatever. There has to be other funding involved, because I don't think the tax scholarships or anything cover the whole cost.
Well, again, I'll let you go first, and then if I've got anything to add, I will. Go ahead.
You're such a gentleman. So I'm not sure where to start with that, but I'll do my best. There are some costs associated with going to public school. They have fees and they have activity fees and things like that. So I don't think any education is completely free, but at least people try to make it affordable. So in that vein, we do the same thing. No one at Holy Savior has ever paid the full cost of education, even pre-tax credit scholarship. And most private schools will work that way, that they have fundraisers. I'm sure you've seen dinner auctions and bingos and cruises and those type of events to raise money to help offset the cost of education. So that's something that we've always done. For some families who come, and we work with each family on an individual basis. So if a family really wants to be at Holy Savior and they can't pay fees, we find somebody to help them do it. We do qualify for hot lunch program. So we served free lunch all last year. We gave away food during COVID. Our teachers showed up, and initially when we didn't know what the danger of COVID was, we had on our full gears if we were in a hospital, covered from head to toe, outside delivering meals to families in the community, free of charge breakfast and lunch. We give away hygiene products free. You come in and you shop for soap, laundry detergent, toiletries, makeup, hairbrush, fingernail polish, because most of the families who qualify for food stamps the food stamps will not let them buy those personal need items. So there are many institutions that are just working above and beyond and trying to get families everything they need. In some cases, we're able to provide more than the public schools able to provide because we have a smaller population. And so those families may benefit and be impacted. Not that public schools don't have the same programs, because I work in organizations where we do go to with the public school and work for immigrant students, provide hygiene products for those students who are homeless, to provide them what they need. And so I think when a private school, from my experience, signs up to support students, they sign up to support them in every aspect that they can, from counseling to parenting sessions to cooking classes. All of those things we try to provide so that we can help the total child and the total family. I hope that helps. Thank you.
So I guess the way I would react is that there are fees for students in public schools now. Generally by state, for example, under state law, you can charge a textbook fee, but if the student can't afford it, and usually the index for that is eligibility for free or reduced lunch, then that is waived. But yeah, simply, do you have clothes? Do you have, school supplies? Certainly in many places, there are fundraising efforts for both public and private schools, because poverty is obviously a major issue. I think, again, I want to go back to, not meaning to sound, the bad guy here or whatever on some of these and what our concerns are. But from everything I've heard about, the school that you're talking, the operations you do, it is a great effort to help some of our neediest kids. And that is certainly to be commended. I think the reality is right now that that's not necessarily what a typical private school is. There are private schools, for example, that have absolutely no kids on free or reduced lunch. Now, some of that may be, again, you might say, well, Mark, if we had, more tax credits or whatever, more of that would happen. That may be the case, but that's where we have, I think, still at this point, that sort of dichotomy. There are some schools like yours. I've done research at like high school level. There are a few what we might call inner city private Catholic schools where the demographics are very similar. That tends to be something of an exception, though. And again, I think that's where the concern is, how do we, if we as a state are going to move forward seeking more of these options, then I think one of the questions that gets raised is, how do we make sure that everyone really can take advantage of that? Dr. Shropshire and other advocates have said, we want to serve every child. We don't want to discriminate against any child. But that's not what these bills that have been passed say. And that's not necessarily what every school's attitude is. Again, you're talking about, I think, the very mission-driven Catholic education system. But again, that's not necessarily going to be true of every program. So I think the difficulty, as you're saying, is, this discussion is not going to go away. I mean, we know in the legislature, there's a lot of strong supports for making this expansion. So I suppose one of the issues that everyone's going to have to talk about is, we're going to go ahead with these ideas. Are there things we can do to create maybe more confidence that it is going to truly benefit all students, that it's not going to be in some way, discriminatory, even if that's inadvertent? How do we make sure that that's actually the case? And that's difficult, because I think there are very strong feelings on this issue on both sides.
And just to dovetail on that, I agree with you wholeheartedly, Mr. Tallman. I just need to say, we're speaking specifically right now about education, but we're talking about a larger issue. We're talking about social justice. We're talking about economics. Of course, if you have more money, you can pay to be more exclusive. We know that's been the history of our country. If you have more money, you can pay to be more exclusive. The tax credits are just at the breaking stage of trying to level the playing field for some students. Some students will never have the opportunity to attend a private school. These scholarships are giving kids that opportunity. Will it help everyone at the same time? No. Is fair equal? No. We are going to be fighting this battle until the cows come home. Because there is no way that we can get every student access to every school. But if we can get some students access to some schools, we can begin to chip away and break down some of the cycle of poverty and get more first-time college students, more people who can change the trajectory of not only their lives, but of their families' lives. And isn't that really what it's all about? So I know this debate is going to continue. There is no one clean-cut answer, because this is just one of the legs of the tripod that we're seated on. We are talking about social justice and economics and opportunity as well. And so education is just one aspect of that. And in order to really resolve this, we need to really address some greater societal issues. I yield back.
I have no response. I'll
Okay.
see if there are any other questions or comments.
And I'm not seeing any other questions. I think mine have been answered. So if anybody else has a question, now would be the time to submit a question for sure. And otherwise, I think we are done. A little bit early, not too early, but a little bit early.
Well, people rarely complain about that, but thank you very much. A pleasure presenting with you, Dr. Shropshire. I look forward to that in the future.
Yes, we'll see each other probably in Topeka sometime. Thank you all so much. And thank you for your great work. Anyone who's working for kids is working for the good. Thank you so much.
And thank you to both of our speakers.